We're live for another episode of Chai Talk with Ojatli for the Left Hook Substack, and I'm joined by Substack superstar and defender of democracy, our Princess Leia, Heather Cox Richardson, because we were just having a nerd conversation about why it is important for me to buy and build Lego sets such as the Millennium Falcon to teach the children. To teach the children, install in them in an early age the need for rebellion and hope against the empire. This is why I have purchased and made the 7,000 piece Millennium Falcon set. But I'm joined by Heather Cox Richardson, a fantastic author, historian. And if you haven't subscribed to her Letters from American Substack, you must. And we are joined here because our democracy is under assault from the forces of fascism and authoritarianism, of greed and cruelty and racism. Heather gave me an inadvertent compliment because she made me realize I'm not crazy. I posted something on Blue Sky a few weeks ago, and I think I said something, Heather, like, America is in this situation because of its failure, our failure to confront what I said were the two enduring sins of this country: greed and racism. And ultimately, they are undoing. And you sent me a very nice note saying that I was right. And I'm like, well, if Heather says I'm right, I must be on the right path. And the framing of this chai talk, this conversation I want to have with you, was how specifically the avatar of greed, the avatar of cruelty, the avatar of racism, Donald Trump, the avatar of the grift, manifested in this vulgarian is ultimately, it seems like, Heather, might be the undoing of this American democratic experiment. But if you disagree with me, let me know. But I see that he is the manifestation of racism and greed, and now that has formed into one person and one administration and one party, the cult of personality. That in less than 3 months, folks, it hasn't even been 90 days, is not just threatening our democracy, but it's threatening the post World War II democratic order. But you're the historian. You're far smarter than me. The ball is in your court.
So actually, I was reacting when I wrote to you to a piece that you'd written, or a thing that you'd written on Blue Sky, in which you said that essentially America's twin sins of racism, greed and racism, greed came first, I think, had destroyed America. And I wrote to you and said it was a kick in the head to me because I disagree with you that they have destroyed America. I think that they are destroying America. I don't think the
Yes.
game's played out yet. But what really surprised me and hit me about that, and actually I one night I actually posted a picture because I had written a letter based on your post, and I just couldn't get it right. It will come out at some point. But what really jumped out to me is that people forget the greed part. When we talk about the failures of our American past, we always focus on racism, and sometimes we focus on sexism, and sometimes we talk about colonialism, but people tend to forget the greed part. And the United States of America, what became the United States of America, the British soldiers on the north. I'm sorry, I'm reading about this for this lecture I was telling you about. The British settlers on the North American continent were a company. People forget that the settlers who came to Massachusetts and to Virginia were literally companies that were supposed to produce revenue for their investors back in England and to some degree in the rest of Europe. Most of it's from England. And that idea that the people in on this continent must produce wealth, value from resources, come what may, is deeply embedded in us. And even the idea of enslavement, we have these amazing letters from the people at Jamestown, because Jamestown was a absolute disaster. It's kind of an interesting story why it was such a disaster, but they come, they're expecting to find gold the way the Spanish found in Latin America. There is no gold, and they're really not equipped for dealing with, trying to pull food and valuable products out of the ground. And so what do? They actually start to die in really large numbers, not only because of the fact that they don't really have enough to eat, but also because they settle in the world's worst place. It's kind of a backwash place in the summer. So they're basically drinking their own sewage, and they get all kinds of diseases. And, so what happens is the people who are in charge of the colony and the company start to treat their laborers worse and worse and worse, and they die like flies. I mean, they're just gotten thrown into a meat grinder. So we have these letters at the time from people who are just enslaving anybody they can find. The indigenous Americans first, and then, of course, after 1619, people from, I think that first group of people who come are actually from the Caribbean. I could be wrong on that, but Afro-Caribbean people, and then later on it's going to be African people. And that whole idea of exploiting others,
Yep.
not just race, but exploiting others for their value and exploiting the resources of this extraordinary continent for not what they can do to make people's lives better, but for cash, is something that I think we're finally putting back on the table. And it's taken the idea of these states going back to child labor, for example, for people to
Yep.
wake up and say, oh, wait a minute, maybe it's not a good idea for the people at the very top to have all the wealth and all the power.
I'm so glad you did the deep dive because it's that marriage between greed and racism, and I call it the two enduring sins. It's capitalism and white supremacy merged together. The exploitation of individuals, of resources, of land, their literal rape and pillage of America, but then given this veneer, right? Manifest destiny, doctrine of discovery. God has commanded us to purge this land, right? To purify the earth. And we are destined by fate and God to go forth and expand. And there might be some trail of tears that kill off, but the indigenous folks, and sure, there might be some enslavement of black people, and women who are 51% of the population. You just birth the next explorer or prophet or warrior. But this is America, the American dream. And I always said, there was a line I wrote once, which I liked. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, that the streets of America aren't paved with gold, they're paved with blood. And we see the manifestation of the greed and the grift mixed in with the racism with Donald Trump. Because, like you mentioned, I think breaking news just came out that they are essentially gutting the $40 billion in funding of the Department of Health and Human Services, the gutting of the Department of Education, the gutting of IRS. And IRS was tax day yesterday, folks. I know it was painful. Sorry. But because of the gutting of the IRS, Heather, guess who can't do audits of billionaires? The
Right.
IRS.
Right. But there are some steps. I mean, one of the things that interests me about the recognition of the importance of greed from the beginning is there's important steps between there and here. And one of the words you just said, capitalism, is one of the things that really interests me because, America always had a trading economy. In the idea, I got curious about this one day because I thought, where do we get the word capitalism? If you think about it, Lincoln talks all the time about capital. People in the 19th century are always talking about capital. And they do talk about capitalists, that is, people with money, but they don't use the word capitalism. We get the word
Mm.
capitalism in the late 1880s. And I'm going to posit, I'm not going to write a book about this yet, but I'm going to posit that that is a response to what they call socialism after 1871. And in the United States, socialism does not have anything to do with the ownership of the means of production the way it comes to be defined in the early 20th century. What it means in the United States is that after the Civil War, when Black men in the South get the right to vote, that also means that that dovetails with the Republican Party's expansion of the concept of taxation. So we get income taxes in the 1860s as well, started by the Republicans. And what people who oppose the idea of Black rights start to say, starting in 1871, after the Department of Justice in 1870 has made it, an imprisonable offense to go after people based on race, is they start to say, hey, we didn't mind Black people at all. We're totally cool with Black people, which is, and literally those same people who the year before were in the KKK, our Ku Klux Klan, are saying, no, no, we don't have a problem with race. Our problem is you have all these poor Black guys because they don't have any money because of enslavement, and they're making decisions about how our tax dollars are going to be used. And that, they say, is socialism, the redistribution of wealth from the people who have to the people who don't have through the idea of creating roads and schools and hospitals and so on. So, if that's the American version of socialism, which is political, it's not an economic system, it's a political system. When you start to talk about capitalism in the 1880s and the 1890s, I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that you're talking about a political system that's
Mm.
imposed on that system of trade, that economic system of trade. And that matters because once you say, instead of having the poor people all control government, you should have all the rich people control government, everything else follows. So if you take that idea that where we are right now is not, the idea of trade, capitalism didn't appear in the concept of capitalism in the United States doesn't appear with Jamestown. The idea appears in the 1880s, and I would argue it's a political system grafted on to the idea of human trade, which we desperately need always, to suggest that only the very rich people should get everything. And then once you've got those pieces in place, of course, that's going to play out through the 20th century.
Yep.
But what you're seeing right now is the attempt of a very small group of people. And it's not just Donald Trump. I mean, he rode on this wave that starts in 1937 and really takes power in 1980, and then she keeps going. This idea that only rich people should control politics, economics, society, and culture. Literally is what we're seeing now is the destruction of that other system right down to the ground so they can rebuild it along those lines.
I don't think you're far off at all, and you talking about the grafting of this type of exploitative model to benefit the aristocracy, which now that I call the broligarchy of the 2025, where Elon Musk, the richest man on earth, gave about $300 million to Donald Trump, and Steve Bannon said that without that money he would not become president, and Elon Musk gave more than $20 million to try to tilt the Wisconsin Supreme Court race. Thankfully, if anyone's here from Wisconsin, I'm seeing a whole bunch of folks. Thank you, folks from Wisconsin, for doing the right thing. A double-digit loss. But you're absolutely right. This is the wealthiest administration in U.S. history that has so many billionaires. You have Linda McMahon, you have
Crazy.
Howard Lutnick. And this type of mindset, Heather, that you're saying, if anyone spends a little bit of time looking at the influences of Peter Thiel, David Sachs, Elon Musk, their influences, folks, and I say this without a hyperbole, they believe in a future which they say capitalism is incompatible with democracy.
That's Peter
Capitalism is
Thiel.
incompatible with democracy. They want to break apart democracy and create techno states, these feudal systems in which the best of the best, the creme de la creme, will rise to the top. And do you want to take a guess, Heather, who are the best of the best? The only people who can be on the top. Want to tell the folks? You want to just, you're the historian here.
Well, so one of the things that about the kind of broligarchy vision that you're talking about is one of the reasons they want to get rid of the US government is because they don't like the idea, for example, that women should be working and women should be part of this, or people of color. They consider that the sort of regulation that stops their brilliance from occurring. But I think not just building these cities. I mean, Musk really wants to get to Mars. And the idea of that is that if statistically it makes sense that we should have met people, other beings by now from other planets, and the fact we haven't suggests that those societies die off just before they manage interplanetary travel. So his idea is to get the right humans onto
Yep.
Mars to launch
Yep.
interplanetary travel, and that will require getting rid of the sorts of things that keep people safe, like the EPA. I mean, this is how he can say he's saving humanity, even though he's one of the largest polluters in two states in the West. So that idea of creating that, these Ubermensch basically is what we're talking
Yep.
about. These superhumans is on that side. Now on the other side, because all the MAGA people are not the same, we have the Project 2025, J.D. Vance, although he kind of bridges the two, J.D. Vance, but also Russell Vogt, who is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and the one who's very quietly doing all the cutting you're talking about. And what has been really clear to me is they have not been talking about what comes next after they get
Yep.
rid of the American system. And it's important to understand that they are not simply finding waste, fraud, and abuse. They've been very articulate in a number of places, including J.D. Vance, that they believe that the entire American system, constructed as it was after World War II by the American people, because for the first time we really had after 1965 an attempt to create a broad democracy, they want to take that right down. I think of it as to the dirt
Yeah.
And they want to rebuild it, but they want to rebuild when they want to take down business and education and government and science and medicine and culture, all those things right down to the dirt. And they want to rebuild them, but they are fervent Christian nationalists.
Yep.
So the guy who's the head of Heritage, wrote a piece that came out 2 days ago, I believe, in Signal, in which he said, now that Donald Trump is president, it's time for him to reaffirm that Jesus Christ runs the United States. And, I don't think people are aware that this is their plan anyway. I don't think Trump cares, but he just wants to stay out of jail and get a lot of money. But, but, the idea we are literally letting this handful of people destroy democracy, and not just the idea of voting, although they're doing that too, but this government that we built to be good for the most number of people. And that's been chipped away at now since the 1980s. We could have a government that really did a lot for a lot of people. And, we're handing it off to these Ubermensch.
Ooh, yeah, the Ubermensch. It's a lot to unpack what you just said, but to tie the threads, for those who aren't nerds and masochists like me and Heather, and spend their time literally
Nerds.
reading.
Are we nerds just because we
We
sit around and read?
Yeah, we are. We're proud nerds, folks. Proud nerds. But you're absolutely right. Look, it's tied together. With Elon Musk, there is a eugenics factor in this, folks, with Peter Thiel and Musk and the broligarchy. And Heather makes a very good point that I think people should realize is that even though they're combined in this MAGA ecosystem, they all have kind of different angles. So Elon Musk and Thiel and Sachs are the billionaire broligarchy, not that religious, but nonetheless believe in the Ubermensch, the white European male that has to be on top. But then you have the white Christian nationalists. And white Christian nationalism was in play at the January 6th insurrection. They had their flags, they had their slogans. And you have representatives of that type of Christian nationalism on the Supreme Court. People are forgetting that Ginny Thomas sent these conspiracy theories and parroted them to Mark Meadows, supporting the violent insurrection, and that Alito's wife, flew not with just one, folks, but two flags associated with January 6th, including the Appeal to Heaven flag that has been, if you will, reappropriated by white Christian nationalists. So, talk to us about a potential collision course, if you will, between the white Christian nationalists and the Musks. Do you see fissures building? Because I see certain fissures building within this MAGA ecosystem that those of us, the majority, can exploit, Heather, to save this democracy. To quote the meme from Godzilla, let them fight.
They are definitely already fighting. You can see this over things like tariffs. Musk went public with his dislike of these blanket tariffs, and actually he got very frustrated because Peter Navarro, the trade advisor who was behind that, those that the I'm sorry, I'm stammering because that insane formula for coming up with
Ron
tariffs.
Vera. I think you meant Ron
That's right.
Vera.
Can you imagine? You know, I'm.
For those who don't know, Ron Vera is the anagram of Navarro, and this dude literally created Ron Vera, an anagram of his last name, and cited him as an expert on his batshit hawkish theories. And this is the guy who's the whisperer to Donald Trump for this disastrous trade war. But continue, Heather. For those
Well,
who didn't
and
know,
but in a little bit of a rabbit hole, a lot of those guys have these alter egos, which I just think is weird. I the idea that you have these different names and they interact with each other in public is just weird, I thought. Anyway, so you can already see them fighting over that Musk did not want the tariffs and he doesn't want the immigration restrictions that yet a third group led by Stephen Miller do want to have. But I think there's a couple of things going on that are worth paying attention to. And one of them is that Trump promised a lot of people a lot of things to get elected in 2024, and he needed to because he was afraid he was going to go to jail. But those
mm,
things are incompatible. And so if you look at his numbers right now, he is under freaking water. The
yep.
only place where he's still somewhat okay is with immigration, but even there, people, yeah, people sort of generally say, yeah, we don't want criminals in our country, not realizing that in fact we already had systems for getting rid of the criminal immigrants in our country. And instead, they really, really dislike the idea of uh, expelling is the word I'm going to come up with, even undocumented immigrants who have lived here for a long time and who have not committed crimes. And this is one of the reasons that this is one of the reasons that Khalil Abrego Garcia is such a I'm
Mm.
sorry, Kilmar Abrego Garcia is such a huge deal, because he's really the guy who falls into, he escaped gangs as a kid who were trying to kill him and take his family's business, and he's always been, full-time employed, and he's got a wife and children, and they're all of a sudden they're trying to construct him into something that represents their idea of the bad guy on which Trump campaigned in 2024. So just today somebody said he was a trafficker. I
Yeah.
mean, there is literally no evidence for any of this. And, who knows? Anything, I mean, you can write whatever you want on this man, but there is no record at all that he has ever done anything that they're accusing him with. He's a stand in for the idea that Trump needs to be doing these really sadistic things that also destroy our Constitution. And that's another major hook of it. So there's this idea that they don't agree. They don't agree on trade. They don't agree on immigration. They do agree on destroying the pillars of American government and of American society. But the tech bros want a weak government. The Christian nationalists and the Stephen Millers want a very strong government. And, these things are, at this point, you can see them fighting over them, because Donald Trump is largely a figurehead who just wants adulation. I mean, he is mentally not okay.
Nope.
So, this idea that this is a juggernaut that can't be stopped, I think is wrong. I think that they're actually being as aggressive as they are because they can see it falling apart. And if you're reading Curtis Yarvin, you can see that he is unhappy. It's not moving fast enough for him.
And Curtis Yarvin, for those who don't know, is, if you will, the fascist guru of Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. And he's also unhappy with the tariffs. And I agree with you with Donald Trump being checked out. When it came to Signalgate, which I still think is a huge story, folks, when Donald Trump was asked if he knew about it, I believed him, Heather. I don't think he has any clue what happened with Signalgate. And I think it was actually Stephen Miller who gave the go ahead.
That's right.
And that should be a huge scandal. But the reason we're not focusing on it, is because there's three more scandals that have come in place. One of them being an unnecessary trade war that seeks to dismantle the U.S. economy and global economy. And like you said, also the illegal kidnapping, detention, and deportation of Abrego Garcia, a Maryland father who was granted withholding of removal. And to me, that case of Abrego Garcia and these 238 immigrants who 60 Minutes did a profile on and said that 75% of these men, folks who were kidnapped without due process, you want to say something? Go ahead.
Bloomberg followed up 90%.
Wow. 90% of these individuals, 238 men who were kidnapped without due process, are now suffering in El Salvador prison. Zero criminal charges. And the two people that Heather mentioned who said, who's the one who said Abrego Garcia was a human trafficker, folks? That was the lie spouted by super Christian Caroline Levitt, White House press secretary, and Pam Bondi, our attorney general, went on Jesse Waters' show and lied to the American public, lied completely to our face. We can read the court documents, and said that Abrego Garcia is part of a foreign terrorist organization. Folks, he was granted withholding of removal, zero criminal charges. The dehumanization. Can you talk about the dehumanization? Because I've been trying to warn people, to quote Niemöller, first they'll go after the undocumented. Then they'll go after the legal immigrants. Then they'll go after the pro-Palestinian activists and students. Then they'll go after the Muslims. And as of this week, the Trump administration said they'll make a penny by outsourcing U.S. citizens to El Salvador. No one listens to me, Heather. They love you. You say it.
So, yes, I mean, there is the idea of othering, and the idea, you can see the way the administration began these flights with individuals that they believed they had constructed this image of them as these terrible human beings. Again, although 90% of them do not have criminal records. But they could do it. They had brown skin, some of them had tattoos, it looked like they could get away with it. And of course, that's began to blow up in their face. But one of the reasons that Abrego Garcia is such a big deal is because he doesn't fit any of the molds. And there's been a real outcry about that. And I do just want to add that, yes, Abrego Garcia belongs in this country, but all of those people on American soil had the right to due process. And for
Yep.
people who write to me and say, well, they were criminals or whatever, it's not it's not them versus you. If they don't have due process, you don't have due process. And one of the things somebody put me onto the other day was before the election, Trump did a live X with Musk in which he talked about the idea of deporting. At first, he starts to talk about murderers and rapists, which is his go to. But then he starts to say, these other countries are brilliant because they're not just getting rid of their murderers and rapists, they're getting rid of their non productive people.
Mm.
Oh
Mm.
boy, that's a big one. That's a big one. And
Sounds, I did not see that coming. I did not see that coming.
exactly, exactly. So that I think is really important to have on the table. But I hope we leave here with hope, because the reason that what you initially wrote to me really sort of made me sit up and take notice was, first of all, the greed thing. But second of all, I don't think it's done yet, because at
I
the
agree.
end of
I
the
don't
day,
think it's done yet. I'm sorry. I agree with you. I didn't mean to lead down. I think it's being destroyed, but I don't think it is completely destroyed.
but let's go back to why we're even in the position we're in, because the truth is that when the American people actually have to do the right thing, they usually do. I mean, we've certainly had incredibly dark moments, from especially the elite enslavers in the American South, and then the KKK, or the Knights of the Golden Circle during the war, and the KKK, and the rise of Nazism, not neo-Nazism, but Nazism in America. And we can do all these things straight through, but those things usually get put down, and they usually get put down not over a huge amount of time. Now, that's not to say, I mean, I have issues about how we could have stopped that. We don't have time for that conversation now. But one of the reasons that I mentioned that about the concept of capitalism as a political system that centers power among a very few people is because I think the reason we're in the mess we're in now is because that very small group of people rigged our system so
Yep.
that the vast majority of Americans cannot make their voices heard. Look at the
Yep.
Supreme Court, look at the Senate, look at the gerrymandering in the House of Representatives, look at voter suppression, which is huge. If I hear one more time that Black people aren't turning out to vote, it's like, have you looked at the voter suppression laws? This is how it works. So, one of the things that I think people are frustrated by now is that the vast majority of Americans do not want this. 4% of Americans who know about Project 2025 wanted it to be in place. So why is it going into place? Because the system has been rigged so that those 4% have far more power than the other 96% of us. And one of the things that Americans can do right now is to make their voices heard, especially older white people like me,
Yep.
because we are much less likely to get in trouble, and be able to be constructed as dangerous people, but also by leveraging social media. And a lot of people are mentioning now short videos, a minute, maybe a minute and a half, in which you talk about how these cuts are affecting you personally. The same way we did things like the ice bucket challenge and so on, would be a really good way for people to make the voice of the American people heard. And once Congress critters are more worried about losing their jobs because of what their constituents are doing versus what Donald Trump is doing. And the Musk's failure in Wisconsin was a really big deal, because they've been
Yep.
saying he can buy the election for you. Turns out he can't. His candidate did worse than other Republicans in that Wisconsin election, looking as if Musk actually hurt him. So we're not helpless yet. And the issue is, it's going to be quite a struggle to get our voices back. Once we get our voices back, I actually think Americans will do the right thing. But getting those voices back is the struggle of this moment, and we're doing it against a group of people who at this point are so deeply into the illegality and the unconstitutional nature of what they're doing, they are not going to go lightly.
We have 27,000 people watching. That's the Heather Cox Richardson effect. It's not me. Some people said, "Why are you talking?" I'm sorry. I'm the guy that invited her. My name is Mujatali. I gotta, what are you gonna do? You can't shut me up. But I'm smart enough to know to let Heather cook. If you can, Heather, stay with me. Two quick last questions because we have a captive audience. Heather is really busy. I had this conversation with Professor Eddie Glaude just about an hour ago. Eddie Glaude, for those who don't know, is at Princeton. He's been on top of this. He's a black man, I'm a brown man. We were echoing some of the sentiments of people from our communities. And this is what folks have been saying. You know what? We did the right thing. We were out on the streets. We came out, black voters, the majority. And yet this country still decided to choose a racist, rapist, criminal vulgarian over a competent black Indian woman, regardless of what you think of Kamala. And so, what some people of color are now saying is, I see this and I go, why should I risk my safety and my security? Why should I be on the streets, right? They need to see me suffer in order to feel great again. So, okay, you do what you got to do, white folks. We're going to take care of ourselves. And it's not that we're going to jump off the boat. We're just going to recoil for a bit, right? And it is something to be said about a lot of people of color, right? That I am not a sociopath, believe it or not, folks. I do not need to see people suffer to feel great again. Even those who voted against me, even those who call me a criminal and a rapist and an invader, you know what I want for them? I want their children to be happy. I want their children to have economic success. I want their children to have health care. I want their children to succeed. Even now, folks, I do not need people to suffer, even MAGA, in order to feel great again. Yet I have to deal with the reality, Heather, that there is a chunk of this country, perhaps 30%, that needs to see me suffer in order to achieve a feeling of greatness. And how should we then, Heather, and I think it's about 70% of us, deal with about a third of our fellow Americans who need this racism, this greed, and this cruelty for the dopamine hit of feeling great?
Well, let's go back just a second here. You left sexism out of that
Yeah,
because
I didn't mean to. Sorry. Yeah.
the reality is that the vast majority of us fall into that category. But let's start there, but let me jump now to the idea of hanging back from this moment. I actually think it's fine for people of color and black Americans to hang back from this moment. I actually think that this is a moment for especially older white people to step forward, and they're doing so. I would also, and I would say that it's okay to hang back, partly because the Black community and the Brown community has carried a lot of weight in the past because of the nature of our civil rights movements, but also because it's safer for people like me to be out in front than it is for people like you. And that's, just makes sense for the community to make sure that that happens. And this is something I've said a lot to young Black men feel like they need to be out there. And I'm like, let me do this one because
Mm,
I'm a lot safer than you are. But I would also say that there are a lot of ways to push back that are not necessarily visible ones. And this is one of the things people make the mistake of thinking, that if there aren't people in the streets, nothing is happening. Now, I happen to think we need to be in the streets, but that
yeah.
doesn't mean there aren't other things that can happen. So one of the things that absolutely should happen with everybody at every level, including Black and brown people and women, is to be working at the local level, school boards, town levels, city levels, state levels, because that's really where things matter in your day-to-day activities. And that is a very different thing than putting your life on the line in a march that could end up going badly. So I think it is okay to say this is a bit of a different moment. And I don't think that that means that anybody is necessarily dropping the ball. As for saying that, what do you do with the fact that 30% of people want you dead or want you hurt? I think more hurt than dead, to be honest. I
Yeah.
think there is in this particular movement a level of, one of the things about authoritarians and the people who hang around authoritarians is, first of all, they know they're weak. They know they couldn't have those jobs unless they were with an authoritarian. But second of all, they need you to be miserable so that they know that they are imposing their will on you. So if you're happy, that means that they don't see that their will is being imposed on you. And so they need to see you miserable. Well, one of the things that we know is that even at its height, a reactionary movement, a reactionary right wing movement, at its height, will get about 33% of a population. And there's always going to be some people who are just like that, whether they're contrary, whether they're, just, I'm not going to use the word, there's always going to be some of those people. But the reason I think we're at the numbers we're at is because this movement has been building a very long time. And one
Yeah.
of the things that we need to do when we reclaim America and an America for everybody is to push these people back under the rock they came from. Because that's really, where they where this kind of mentality should be in a healthy society. They'll always be there, but they shouldn't be running everything.
I want to ask this final question, and thank you for the 30,000 people who have tuned in. And I also appreciate, I was talking about myself and my own family. It's not just people of color and immigrants and Muslims, women, LGBTQ, dissidents, anyone who goes against a fascist, and you're a historian and a scholar, you know that fascists are not loyal to anybody. They go after everyone. And you mention a word which I really like and I think should be stressed by people. Ultimately, they are weak. Donald Trump is weak. Elon Musk is weak. It's never enough for them, no matter how many compliments they get, no matter that he actually won the 2016 or 2024 election. No, he needs to bend reality to make you believe he won the 2020 election. He needs the validation, and it's never enough. These are weak, fragile, fickle men and women who know deep down that the majority loads them, and they need power, and they need that. The exertion and abuse of power over the rest of us because they have weak knees and even weaker jaws. And as such, you need the majority to step up and figuratively, I'm saying figuratively, punch a bully in the face. And breaking news just came out as of 3 minutes ago. The Trump administration is asking the IRS to revoke Harvard's tax exempt status. Now, you talked about what the people can do, Heather. I think you share my frustration that the institutions, overwhelmingly, not all, have bent the knee in advance. Columbia University, it still wasn't enough. Look at what they make you give to court the born identity. These law firms, Perkins Coie is an example of one that didn't bend the knee. Thank you, Perkins Coie and others. Costco didn't bend the knee, unlike Target. Thank you, Costco. Harvard didn't bend the knee. Thank you, Harvard. But yet, like a mob boss, now they're literally punishing Harvard. Oh, nice university you got there. Shame if something happened to you. In the face of this overt fascist threat, as they're cracking down on Harvard and the law firms and ABC News and CNN, your advice to the establishment, to the institutions who think by bending the knee, they'll be safe.
Well, you never are. That anybody who thinks, and this has frustrated me since the beginning, the Republican Party could have stopped Trump in 2015. It could have stopped him in 2016. It could have stopped him in 2017. All the way, it could have stopped him in his first impeachment. It could have stopped him in his second impeachment. And anybody who thinks that he is not going to take and take and take until he is stopped just simply has no concept of how a personality like that works or a movement like that works. And I'm thrilled that Harvard stood up to him, because that would have been a real loss if they had not. That being said, we are not powerless there either. So you mentioned Costco versus Target. Target's numbers have plummeted steadily and Costco's have risen. There are 334 million people in this country or thereabouts, and we actually have a lot of say in how things go. So one of the things that's happened to the law firms that have bowed to Trump. And by the way, Josh Marshall at Talking Points Memo has a very good point today in which he says, there really isn't an agreement.
Mm,
Trump keeps talking about this agreement with the law firms, and basically he's said to them, "You have to give me free legal services," which is interesting. From my perspective, I'm not a lawyer, but if somebody said that to me and I felt like I had to do it, I might give them those services, but they wouldn't win any cases. That should, to me, it's like, you're going to hold a gun to a doctor's head and say, "I want you to operate on my heart." That's going to go well, right? Anyway, um, but the even the law firms are seeing now that people don't want to take jobs with them, that not everybody, certainly there are always going to be people who are like, "Oh, it's just a business," which is all a law firm is. But the degree to which we can support the people who are standing up against the Trump administration, the more it will give courage to other people to do the same thing. And this is true
there you
not only
go.
for institutions, this is true for lawmakers, and it's also true for individuals. And one of the things that I really would love to emphasize here is that, there I retweeted somebody who, he's funny because in all of my books he's a villain at this he was a villain for my first several books, and then he became kind of a hero. And,
Mm,
he was really, in my opinion, a villain,
mm,
he was a neocon. And I retweeted him because he said something that I thought was very valuable. And someone said, "Oh, you can't touch that guy. He's a neocon," and so on. You know what? At this point, in this moment, all hands on deck. The ship is
All hands on
sinking.
deck.
It does not matter who the other person is next to you pulling up the main sheet. Shut up and pull with them. We can sort it all out on the other side. And the thing about that is that's what America did in the 1850s when we got the rise of the Republican Party. And a lot of people jumped onto the Republican Party simply to stop the country from being taken over by an oligarchy of the elite slave owners. And literally, they were like, we disagree about everything, and I pretty much hate you, but that's okay. We'll do this together. At the end of the Civil War, it was really interesting because a lot of the people who came into that coalition being like, yeah, I'm here forever and I'm going to be with you, were real, they were not supporters and they ended up wandering off, often to try and make their own political careers. And some of them did a lot of damage. But a lot of people who came into that coalition really switched and became fervent believers in it. And you don't know who that's going to be. So, one of the things, yesterday was the anniversary of the death of Abraham Lincoln, as I'm sure you know. Um, and one of the things about that I always remember is he shot on the 14th, the night of the 14th, and a lot of people are crowded around his bed. And one of the people who is there is Edwin Stanton, who was his Secretary of War. And Stanton was a Democrat before the war. He comes into the cabinet as Secretary of War after the Republican crashes and burns because of corruption. And he's not a believer. He's like, well, I'm going to come in here because I'm the one who can straighten this mess out, kind of thing. And by the time that Lincoln is dying in that bed and Stanton is there, he's the one, when Lincoln dies, who says, and now he belongs to the ages. And
Mm,
the reason that I mention that is because Stanton, after Lincoln died, for weeks just wandered the streets of Washington sobbing. His
mm.
friends thought he had had a mental breakdown because his world had fallen apart. Now, if you told him that was going to be the case 4 years before, he'd have been like, not me, honey bunch. But we don't know what the other side of this is going to look like. And some of the people who right now might seem to be enemies might turn out to be people with really good ideas. And some of your best friends might turn out to be people that you will not be speaking to in 15 years. So at this point, let's give each other a little bit of charity and grace and try to move forward in effective ways. And what one person's effective way is might not be somebody else's. But so long as we're carrying some kind of water, let's try and do it together and sort it all out later.
Saving democracy is a group project. And like you said, it's all hands on deck, folks. We're all in it. To quote Bruce Springsteen, it's going to be a long walk. And to bring things back full circle, you said courage is contagious, but so is hope. Courage and hope is contagious. People need to see it. And to bring back things back full circle and full nerd circle, we started with the Millennium Falcon. Star Wars. Rebellions are built on hope. And hope is optimism with a plan. It's not just optimism, you have to do something. Hope is faith in action. And I'm a father of three kids. I've lived a good life, folks. I've said this before, I'll say it again. I've lived longer than I thought I would. Read my book, it'll make sense. But my three kids are cute, they're sweet, they're kind, and their generation deserves better. And so for their generation, I cannot afford to be cynical. I cannot afford to be apathetic, even though it's comforting, but it's also cheap and lazy. That generation deserves better. And with the time that we have to do our part. Everyone has a role to play. I believe everyone has a superpower. And I agree with you, Heather, that I think if you look at history, there's always been, no matter how crazy something's happening, 25 to 30% of the country's lost. But that means we have 70%. We have the numbers, and they know we have the numbers. So once the numbers organize against a fascist regime, especially this regime, cowards, fickle, weak, with weak chins and weak jaws, you see them crumble, folks. And so what I say, Heather, and I don't know if you agree with this analogy, this is my analogy. This is how I've reconciled it. Even though there's 30% of this country that needs to see me suffer in order to feel great again. This is what I say. The caravan has 70%. I won't win the 30%. I'll take the 70%. The caravan has to move forward. There's a great saying in the Middle East and South Asia. The dogs bark, but the caravan moves forward. But this is a test for me, Heather, to what you said. Instead of conquering people, I think a democracy is better saved by capturing and converting, right? Bring on people, all hands on deck. So this is what I say. The caravan moves forward. My door will always be open. My hand will always be outreached. But it's your job to grab my hand and get on board. The caravan has to move forward, folks. There's 34,000 people who joined this Substack Live. The most I've ever had. That's the Heather Cox Richardson effect. I was supposed to talk to her for only 30 minutes. She stayed on for 45 minutes. Follow her if you don't. Letters from an American. It's a fantastic Substack. Read her books. There are numerous books. The one that came out a year and a half ago, Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America, is fantastic. And before we leave, Heather, shamelessly promote yourself.
The truth is that I'm just a writer. I mean, and the whole point of who I am is that I'm just a regular person. There's no need to here's my shameless promotion. Here's my goal. If I do my job right, you will all forget about me. The whole idea here is, I kind of answer to the past as well as the present and the future. I'm trying to bring forward the best principles of the past into our future. And if I do it right, there will come a day when I won't need to write anymore. This stuff, I'll keep on writing history books that no one reads. And someday somebody will go, remember that woman? Who was she? And I will be in my kayak with a bag of M&Ms, paddling around the island, and nobody will ever have to know about me.
What's your favorite M&Ms? That's my top three as well. What's your favorite M&M?
I hate to say, I'm so bad. Crispies, which they don't have anymore. The blue ones, they were the best. Um, Plain is really my go-to, but if I feel like I have to eat healthy, I go for the peanut ones. How about you?
Plain. I'm a sucker for plain, and even though I'm trying to be healthy, M&Ms, they just do something. You know what? We all deserve something, folks. Don't knock Heather for enjoying her M&Ms. And I'm Wajat Lee for the Left Hook Substack. It's the lefthook.substack.com. Like a fool, I have kept everything for free. I don't believe in paywalls during the decline of democracy. So I'm like Blanche Dubois from A Streetcar Named Desire. I depend on the kindness of strangers. It's reader supported. And I'm lucky enough to be in conversation with Heather. Thank you all for listening. It's 35,000. I think Heather dropped many gems. Please share this wide and don't give up hope and don't give up. Last thing I'll say, we have the numbers, people. We have the numbers. And don't give up your humanity as well. Last thing I'll say is, even though there are monsters that are attacking us, you do not have to become the monster. You can
That's
show a better path. And I think if you show a better path, you can capture and convert a lot of folks. All hands on deck, folks. This is it. Constitutional crisis, DEFCON 2. All hands on deck. It's a long walk. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, everyone.
Thank,
Be
thank you.
kind,
It's
be
been a
good to each
pleasure.
other. And please, oh, please, don't be a fascist. Take care. I